My name is Tyler Pace. If I haven't gotten a chance to meet you, I'm the director of college and young adults, and so good to be with you worshiping this morning. And I want to begin by asking you all, in this busy season of Advent, anticipating Christmas, coming off of Thanksgiving so recently, I want to ask you, how are you? How are you? Kind of a terrible question, but we ask it all the time. I probably asked about 20 people so far this morning this question, and usually we have a pretty proper response. But sometimes we ask ourselves, do we lie or be honest? Sometimes a moral dilemma. I love the people who, when asked this question, they respond, do you actually want the honest answer? And sometimes I'm like, do you want my honest answer to that honest question? Because sometimes I don't really want to know your honest answer. Anyway, let me ask you a different question, but similar. How is your peace? How is your peace? There's this common Jewish greeting, which is the Hebrew word for peace. You might have heard this before, shalom. Shalom. The Bible uses this word in a similar way to greet people. Actually, in Genesis chapter 43, we see this when Joseph is speaking to his brothers who do not recognize him just yet. And here's what he says to them. He asked them how they were, literally shalom. And then he said, how is Shalom, your aged father, you told me about? Is he still living? The response was, yes, he's doing well. In fact, he is literally shalom. This word occurs over 230 times in the Old Testament alone, and it has this sense of wholeness, completeness. It can refer to a stone that has no cracks. Often it's talking about a complex system that is in order, and so I know all of our lives are very complex. There's a lot going on, and so let me ask you again, how are you? How is your complex system doing? Or maybe let me ask you to reflect on this. When was the last time you experienced this kind of peace or wholeness? I know for me it was actually sometime last week. So if you thought your Thanksgiving was a little rough, I'm right there with you. I was sick like all of last week. But despite that, I had this moment. This was last Tuesday. I finished up some things pretty early, so I went up to pick up my daughter. And we got home, and the scene was nothing but serene. There were a lot of dirty dishes in the sink. There were toys scattered throughout almost every room. I should probably get dinner prepped soon. I was thinking about emails that I still needed to answer, and also about this sermon that I should probably start writing. But then my daughter came up to me with books, and she wanted me to sit down and read to her, and so I did, and we sat down and read. And when I thought about that, I remember thinking, this is it. This is peace. This is wholeness and fullness. So much so, I even snapped a selfie of my daughter and I in a moment. So even as you can see, we don't look that great. You know, there's a lot going on, but despite the chaos around us, there was this wholeness. This is what I was supposed to be doing in that moment. And let's all admit there's some chaos that exists around us, isn't there? Of course, we can name the places in our world where chaos exists, and also in our own lives. I wonder if there are some messy things in your life. Our lives in this world is complex. There is a lot going on. And so I actually think this kingdom characteristic of peace is one that is maybe most needed today. And so it is peace, shalom, that we come to next in the season of Advent, this season of waiting and longing for the coming Messiah, who we know as the Prince of Peace. And so we're going to reflect on this theme together as we look at Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 to 7. If you would like to turn there now, I'll be reading from the NIV. And we're going to focus on these four questions. We might not answer them fully, but we'll focus on these four questions together. If you're a note taker, what is peace not? What is peace? How do we get it? And what do we do with it? And now let us read Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 to 7. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord will accomplish this. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Maybe for a lot of us, these verses are very familiar. Certainly they are anchor verses for Advent, but I don't want us to jump too quickly to us. Scripture was certainly written for us, but it was not written directly to us. So context is important, especially for helping us answer this very first question: what is peace not? And so these verses were written to a rebellious Israel, God's people, who were on the brink of being conquered by a foreign nation and taken into exile. In fact, these positive words of hope are actually surrounded by words of judgment and darkness. Let's just read some of them. This is just before chapter 9 in Isaiah 8. Then they will look toward the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom. And they, this is Israel, will be thrust into utter darkness. I do not see this verse on any of your Christmas cards. I wonder how much it would take to put this on your Christmas card. It's just not natural, but these verses are all over surrounding the passage that we just read. And if you read these passages, Isaiah is making an indictment against Israel's kings, and for one specific reason. And so we're going to do a quick history lesson. And if there's any point to doze off in the sermon, this is not that point, okay? This is really important stuff. So prior to Isaiah 9, historically, Israel had had a lot of stability in their kingdom. This was most likely due to the military powerhouse Assyria having a weak lineage of kings. And so because of that, Israel had a lot of stability. But then all of a sudden, Tiglath-Pileser III came to power. And so with a name like that, with a beard like that, you better make stuff happen. And he certainly did. So Tiglath started to expand Assyria's territory in the east. And as they did this, smaller nations like Israel had a choice. Are we going to be pro-Assyria and submit to their empire, or are we going to be anti-Assyria and try to defend ourselves? What do you think they did? Now, maybe the smart political move would be to make a treaty with the king of Assyria, but God's people were not always called to do the smart political thing. Actually, in fact, they were called to trust God as their king, and they were actually forbidden to make treaties with foreign nations. But let's see how King Ahaz responded to this lack of stability. This is in 2 Kings. Ahaz sent messengers to say to Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, "I am your servant and vassal. Come up and save me." And Ahaz took the silver and gold found in the temple of the Lord and in the treasuries of the royal palace and sent it as a gift to the king of Assyria. Okay, did we see what just happened? And I promise, just a little bit longer here with this history lesson. King Ahaz was not declaring that he was God's servant and vassal, but rather the king of Assyria's servant and vassal. And not only that, but he had the audacity to take treasures from the Lord's temple and give them as a gift to this foreign king. This is textbook idolatry. King Ahaz not trusting in God, but putting his trust in another king in an effort to obtain peace. And I know we are in such a different time. This might seem irrelevant to us, but King Ahaz, what he thought, he was in a life or death situation. And so what did he do? He made things happen on his own. It seemed that the smart, clear, logical way out of this and his people's mess was to compromise and make this agreement with the king of Assyria in order to obtain peace. He was trying to figure out the smartest way to obtain peace and keep it, and how often do we do the same? To go back to our first question, what is peace not? I think we learn from King Ahaz two lies that we believe about peace. And the first is that we somehow achieve it on our own, that we obtain peace on our own. And another is that peace is future-oriented. In other words, if I just would do these things, or if I would just get to this point, then I will finally have peace. It was about 7 years ago that my now wife, Kinsey, and I got engaged. And so our engagement was just under a year, so very doable. But she moved down to Dallas right after we got engaged, and I was still up in Chicago. So most of our engagement was long distance. And so during this time, I had this great vision. While we were doing long distance and I was still a single, non-married man, I was going to cherish the months that I had left, because once I got married, I was married. So I had this great vision. Of course, Kinsey and I texted and we would FaceTime occasionally, but I was going to be with the boys. And so, as you can imagine, there were a couple of frustrations on Kinsey's end, and she would push back in some ways. I need more time talking with you. Why are you always with, quote, the boys? And one time, Kinsey and I were talking about this, and I said, oh, Kinsey, I love you so much, but you see, I have this vision. We're already engaged to be married, so once we get to that wedding day, once I move down to Dallas, then we'll be married, and then you'll have my attention from that point on. And so as you can imagine, the rest of the conversation was anything but peaceful. But see, I had this vision, and I was, just to say I was wrong, by the way, but I had this vision that peace and wholeness for our relationship was somehow in the future. That, hey, if we just get to this point, then we'll be good. Maybe for you, it's a demanding project you're on or a really tough season you're in, and you think, if I just get done with this project, or if I just get out of this season or this relationship, then I'll have peace. Maybe you want your family to look a certain way once we have a baby, once our kids are out of the house, once our kids get their act together, then we'll have peace. Maybe you've been hurt, and though your pain is really real, you think, if the person who hurt me just got what they deserve, then I'll be okay. Or maybe it's an illness or sickness, and you think, once I get done with this thing, then I'll have peace. But peace is not future-oriented, and it's not accomplished by our own means. And so if this is the case, let's ask this second question together. What then is peace? And really, it's kind of just the opposite of what we've said. So let's explore this a little bit. And our text points this out with this child metaphor in verse 6. For to us a child is born. This child metaphor is very big for Isaiah. He actually uses it back in chapter 7 and in chapter 8. And in both cases, a child was this metaphor, this gift from God in order to teach Israel, God's people, something. And every time the child metaphor is used, especially here in chapter 9, it has been about God giving his people a child in order to receive something. In other words, especially here in chapter 9, peace was going to come from God. It was going to be a gift from God to Israel. It was not going to come solely from within Israel. So if peace is not something that we can attain ourselves or work hard enough to get, then what we see in this passage is that peace is given. From the outside, peace is not an accomplishment, it is a gift, and specifically a gift from God. And not only that, but peace is not future-oriented, it is available to us now. And it's fascinating in this passage, in the verses previous that were before this passage, and I will qualify, fascinating to me, is that when you look at all of the verbs that are leading up to this passage, it's really just one tense in the Hebrew that's used. And so the Hebrew has this perfect tense that's being used, which a perfect tense describes an action or situation as a complete whole. But there's another tense that the Hebrew has, which is the imperfect tense, which describes an action or situation as an ongoing process. And so to simplify, perfect tense is like a picture, complete whole. Imperfect tense is like a video, ongoing process. And Isaiah, so far in chapter 9, has strictly been using the perfect tense, almost as a way to affirm that, yes, you see this picture of God's future reality through his Messiah. This will happen. But then all of a sudden, at the very end of this passage in verse 7, hear the words. It switches to the imperfect tense. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Or more accurately, is accomplishing this. It's like all of a sudden, for the first time in this chapter, it switches to the imperfect tense. And I know, you're like on the edges of your seat, like, nice move, Isaiah. What are you trying to show us? And here's the point. While declaring the reality that God will bring about this eternal, peaceful kingdom, this will happen. Isaiah says at the end in verse 7, actually, the zeal of the Lord is making this happen right now. Peace is not only a future reality, it is a present one. We don't have to work to get peace because God is working right now to give us peace. And it is this peace that is available to every single one of us, even today. And so it begs this third question: how do we then get it? And maybe this is, as we see, not the best question. Maybe a better one is, how do we situate ourselves to receive this gift from God? I've been reading a great Christian thinker, Jacques Philippe, recently, and specifically his book that's titled Searching for and Maintaining Peace. He opens with the reality that our present age, we live in this time of agitation and inquietude. In other words, a lack of peace. And one theme in this book that struck me is the idea of abandonment or detachment from the things of this world as a way to obtain peace. And here's what he says about this. The measure of our interior peace will be that of our abandonment, consequently of our detachment. Abandonment inevitably requires an element of renunciation, and it's this that is most difficult for us. Because as humans, we have a very natural tendency to cling to other things besides God. Is this not why John Calvin famously said that the human heart is a perpetual idol factory? As we saw with King Ahaz, he had this vision of a peace in the future, and so he actually clung to a foreign king in order to get it. And what do we cling to? And I mean, when I was thinking about this, I kept thinking about our social media culture and even the influencer culture. I feel like everyone is telling me everything that I didn't know that I needed. Like, go get this thing, buy this gift, or go do this thing. There's so much out there that's telling us once we do this thing or get this thing, then we'll have peace. My wife and I have these friends, Sean and Sarah, and I'd like to tell you a little bit of their story as a way to illustrate this. And so they were some of our first friends in Dallas. They've been married for almost 9 years now, and several years ago, they decided that they were going to foster. And so if you foster or you know families who foster, you know the process of being trained and even applying is a really lengthy and tedious one. But they did this, they got it all in order, and I'll never forget their first placement. These wonderful 5-year-old twins were sent to their house. Of course, they were so cute, and Sean and Sarah loved them so well. But if you're familiar with the homes that a lot of these kids come from, there's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of hurt, and so they come with many challenges. There's so much love and care that is needed with these kids, and we got to watch Sean and Sarah meet so many of those needs for these twins. Something that Sean and Sarah shared about what they were always willing to do was adopt if that was needed. But with reunification as the end goal, that's not always the best option, and so these twin girls eventually found another home with family members, and although we celebrate that reunification, I remember Sean and Sarah grieving that they built this relationship with these twins and now didn't have them in their house any longer. But they kept going, fostering toddlers to 7-year-olds to tweens, even to a newborn baby, and they've fostered now 8 kids, and they've adopted 1. So my wife and I had lunch with them the other day. We were catching up and reminiscing of these 2 boys that they had just recently fostered and are no longer with them. That again, these boys that they loved but came with their challenges, there was times of joy but times of great difficulty. They were sharing about actually how the past season of having these boys was the most exhausting season that they've ever been in. We asked them how they did it, and they said pretty confidently, this is what God has called us to do. We kept talking, and eventually, Kinsey and I just shared how much we admired them, how much we looked up to them, and how much their faith encouraged ours. And I'll never forget what Sarah said to us. She responded to that with a quote from Bonhoeffer. She said this, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. You know, at first I'm like, it's 2 p.m. on a Friday, like take it easy with that. That's a little intense for me, but I actually did keep thinking about it a little longer. And as I did, an overwhelming sense of peace came over me. And I thought, that's it. That's what peace looks like. Even though if you would look at their life with different foster kids in and out, both of them working outside the home, 2 dogs and a cat, a very busy schedule, just like most of us, maybe you would not immediately think peace. I mean, they have had their own fair share of health issues, of family drama, of career ups and downs, and nonetheless, they have this single-minded devotion. When Christ calls me, he bids me come and die and follow him. And when we say, I'm okay with that, that is peace. Peace is not a feeling or some future-oriented accomplishment. Peace is a disposition. It is an attitude of the heart that says, when Christ calls me, he bids me come and die, and I will follow him. And we say to God, not my will, but your will be done. Peace is Abraham saying, I'm 100 years old. I really don't think we can have a child, but God, I am going to trust you anyway. Peace is Joseph staying faithful to God despite being abandoned by his own family. Peace is Moses knowing he cannot enter the promised land, but standing on the mountaintop and commissioning Joshua to go there anyway. Peace is barren Hannah praying for a son and staying faithful to her promise to devote him to the Lord. Peace is the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Peace is Esther risking her own life to advocate for God's people while in exile. Peace is Mary and her yes to Gabriel. I am the Lord's servant. May it be done to me according to your word. And peace, of course, is Jesus, who was abandoned by his friends. But that wasn't the worst part. He was accused of things that he never actually did. That wasn't the worst part. He was then beaten. He was in so much physical pain before being put on the cross, one of the most excruciating ways to die. That still wasn't the worst part. Hanging on the cross, Jesus was then wondering whether or not his own Father was going to abandon him, and that was the worst part. But you know, some of his last words were this, Luke 23, verses 46, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. If I were there, and even now as I hear those words, I wonder if some of you can relate, that sure doesn't sound or look like peace, but that is peace. The Messiah, the one Isaiah prophesied about, the Prince of Peace, turned the most violent weapons, the cross, into the means of peace, which brought reconciliation between humans and God. Jesus is not only the ultimate peacemaker, peacegiver, and peacekeeper, he is peace itself. And friends, because Christ dwells in us, we get to go out and share this peace with others. We get to be a walking embodiment of this kind of peace. And so just for one moment, let's reflect on this last question together. What do we do with peace? Simple answer is we give it away. And so I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, the idea of a giving plate. So does anyone have a giving plate in their house? We might have a picture of one if you're not familiar. Does anyone have this giving plate at your house? Okay, good. That's good, because I was tricking you. You shouldn't, because the whole point is that you give this plate to someone else, right? So good. The whole idea is that you receive, hopefully, some yummy baked goods from someone. You then return the favor, bake some goods, and give the plate to someone else. The same is true with our peace. We are meant to get with God, to encounter him, to receive his peace, and then we are to go out and share that with others. And I think it's in doing this that we are most in line with Christ. And I say that because of this beatitude. You may be familiar with this in Matthew 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Why is it that peacemakers will be called children of God? I think it's because the child of God, the one Isaiah prophesied about, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, came to earth over 2,000 years ago with one goal in mind, and that was to establish peace between humans and God. This is the heart of the gospel, and when we go to establish peace in the world around us, in our families, at our school, in our grocery stores, in our city, we are acting out our adoption as sons and daughters of the God of peace. And we get to carry this peace wherever we go, and I do want to be clear, this is Advent. It's all about longing. So though this peace is available to us today, it is not complete until Christ comes again. So may we be a people who carry this peace wherever we go, but may we also be a people who long for the day that Christ comes again to establish this peace that will never end. Lord, haste the day. Let's pray. God, we long for your peace. We long for the day that you will return again to establish your peace forever. But until then, we know that we can carry this peace with us wherever we go. Lord, help us. In each of our lives, we long to see this peace on display. Lord, show up in mighty ways as we show up to be present with you. Show up to us to give us this peace, and may we be receptive. And Lord, then empower us through your Spirit to go out and establish this kind of peace in the world around us. And we pray, we're not just peacemakers here in this church, but we are peacemakers out into this neighborhood and in the city of Dallas and the world. Empower us to go out and do that. Lord, you can do great things. You have done great things, so may you do great things through us. Amen.